There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. You ever been in a town that's too quiet? Not in a calm, gentle way, but the kind of quiet that settles over everything, like dust, like shame. That was Bell's Hollow, a slow, sun-baked little place out in New Mexico, where Sunday mornings rolled in like clockwork and the church bells knew their part by heart. That morning, the town stirred under a thin sheet of golden light. Folks moved like they always did, quiet, efficient, keeping to what was expected. And in the middle of all that stillness was a girl with tired hands and downcast eyes. Her name was Mary Ann. She was 19, though you might guess older by the way she moved, like her bones were borrowed from someone twice her age. She worked for the church, cleaning, carrying, doing a kind of jobs no one thanked you for, but everyone noticed if you missed. You've probably seen a girl like that before, maybe in your own hometown, maybe in a hallway at school, or maybe in a quiet moment you don't talk about much. You were her, the kind of girl who learned early how to disappear in plain sight. That morning, she was carrying heavy pots across the chapel courtyard, shoulders hunched, not from weight, but from something heavier. She didn't speak, didn't complain, just moved slow, deliberate, like sudden motion might betray something she wasn't ready to show. But pain has a way of slipping through, doesn't it? She was crouched by the stove, stacking firewood when it happened. A breath caught in her throat, barely a sound, but it was real. One of the churchwomen, Sister Darlene, heard it as she passed behind. She paused, raised an eyebrow, and asked with a smirk, "Why you moving like a colt with a sore leg, child?" Mary Ann stood up slow, didn't look anyone in the eye, and then she whispered something so soft it almost vanished into the air. "It hurts when I sit." That was it. Just a sentence, but one that could stop you in your tracks. And for one heartbeat, the room did go still. The pans stopped clanging, the flour dust hung in the air like snow. You'd think maybe someone would ask what she meant, maybe lean in, offer a kind word, a hand. But that's not how silence works in places like Bell's Hollow. Not back then. Sister Darlene gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind that hides behind politeness. "Well, maybe if you didn't slouch so much," she said, and walked on. And just like that, the world spun again, as if nothing had been said at all. But someone did hear her. Across the road, under the blacksmith's awning, a man leaned against the frame of his forge, silent, still, watching. His name was Caleb Rye. Folks called him a loner. Said he hadn't spoken much since his wife and little girl died some 15 years ago. Grief made him quiet, but not blind. He saw Mary Ann the way people rarely do, not just her silhouette. He saw the way her body resisted every step, the way pain rippled through her movements like bruises beneath Sunday cotton, and he didn't look away. You know, I keep thinking about that moment. How many times do we pass someone like Mary Ann and pretend we don't notice? Maybe it's easier to stay quiet, to mind our business. But what if the one thing they need is for someone not to? That day, Mary Ann went back to scrubbing the stone steps behind the chapel, her hands raw, her dress soaked at the hem. She tried to sit again, just for a second, and flinched so hard it looked like her whole body betrayed her. And still, Caleb Rye watched. He didn't speak, not yet. But in a town full of silence, his noticing made a sound of its own.
Sometimes the worst kind of pain doesn't leave a bruise you can see. It hides in plain sight, behind polite smiles, behind Sunday sermons and the smell of fresh cornbread in the church hall, behind hands folded in prayer and voices that speak of grace but never justice. That was the world Mary Ann lived in, and no one seemed willing to admit it. She was taken in by Reverend Silas Coates when she was just 14, right after her parents died in a fever that swept through Bell's Hollow one bitter summer. Folks called it an act of mercy, said the Reverend was a man of God doing the Lord's work by giving a grieving orphan a roof over her head. But mercy don't feel like salt in your wounds. Mercy doesn't look like a cot without a mattress in a cold back room. It doesn't sound like the slap of a wooden spoon or taste like blood on your tongue because you moved too slow. Lucille, his wife, ran the house with a tight jaw and a hard hand. She told Marianne that humility was best learned on her knees, that silence was a virtue. And Marianne, she believed them, or at least she tried to. Because what else do you believe when you're a child and the people hurting you are the same ones telling you it's for your own good? I've seen this kind of cruelty before. Maybe you have too. Maybe not in a church or with a ladle, but in the kind of homes where the lights are always off in the evening, where the neighbors lowered their voices when walking past, where kids flinch when someone raises a hand too fast, even if it's just to brush away a fly. And the town? Well, the town of Bell's Hollow saw everything and said nothing. People always say, if I'd known, I would have done something. But the truth is, they knew. They knew when Marianne winced getting into the pew, when she wore long sleeves in the dead of summer, when her eyes stopped meeting anyone else's. They just chose not to look too close. Because to look too close means admitting that the man who baptized your children, who prayed over your father's grave, who shook your hand every Sunday morning, might also be the same man who turned a child into a servant, a ghost, a target. And that's not an easy truth to sit with. But here's the thing that haunts me. When Marianne whispered, "It hurts when I sit," not a single person leaned in to ask why. Not one. She wasn't asking for pity, she was testing the water, seeing if anyone cared enough to listen, really listen. And they failed her. It's hard, you know? It's hard to admit that the people we trust with holy words and good deeds might be the same ones causing harm behind closed doors. But that's what makes this story matter, because Marianne's pain didn't come from monsters. It came from people the town respected, people who wore clean clothes and spoke with calm voices and told her she was lucky to be there. I think about that a lot, how easy it is to confuse authority with goodness. Marianne suffered in silence not because she wanted to, but because no one offered her anything else, not a question, not a hand, not even a second glance. Except for one man. But that part comes later. For now, all you need to know is this. Behind the stained glass and hymns, behind the aprons and prayers, there was a girl, hurting, and a whole town that didn't want to see it. That's how pain lingers. Not in the bruises, not in the broken skin, but in the echo of the things no one said.
Not everyone who's quiet is blind. Some people stay silent because they've already lost too much to waste words on what doesn't matter. And Caleb Rye, well, he was one of those men. The folks in Bell's Hollow didn't think much about him anymore. He was the blacksmith. The quiet one, lived just past the edge of town with a forge that burned hotter than most men's tempers. He hadn't said more than a handful of words to anyone in over a decade, and no one expected him to. But silence, for Caleb, wasn't emptiness. It was memory. See, years back, he lost everything that made noise in his world. His wife, gentle, steady, and their daughter, Rose. She was just 7 when the fever came, one of those bad winters where the sky never really brightens and the cold crawls up through the floorboards no matter how hard the fire works. Caleb held her in his arms the night she passed, body burning, breath slipping away faster than he could call it back. After the burial, he stopped speaking, said all he needed to say to the dirt and the cedar tree he planted above her. So, he didn't talk much. Didn't smile, but he saw, and that made all the difference. Because one morning, standing under the awning of his forge, hands blackened with ash, Caleb saw her, Marianne. She was scrubbing the stone steps outside the chapel, barely more than a shadow of a girl, thin at the wrists, bones moving like they'd forgotten how to trust the body they lived in.
And when she tried to sit, just for a second, her whole frame jolted like something inside her had broken long ago and never quite healed. She didn't cry, didn't whimper, just bit her lip and pushed through it like pain was a language she'd been fluent in for years. And Caleb, he recognized it. Not just the pain, but the way she carried it, quiet, like it was her duty, like she thought nobody would listen, even if she dared to speak. You ever see someone and feel like your body remembers them before your mind does? That's what it was like for him. Marianne didn't look like his daughter, but the way she moved, the hesitation in her step, the wince she tried to hide, the weight in her silence, it pulled something loose in him, something he thought had rusted over for good. I think grief has a shape, you know? And sometimes we see it walking around in someone else before we admit it's still living in us. For Caleb, watching Marianne was watching a story he'd once lived through, too late to change. He thought of Rose then, of her laughter, her little hands leaving wildflowers on his anvil, of how she used to ask questions about the world like everything was a wonder. That memory, so tender it could cut bone, rose up in him like smoke. And standing there in the heat of the morning, hammer still in hand, Caleb didn't move, didn't call out, but his jaw tightened, his breath slowed, because now he saw what the town refused to see. This girl wasn't invisible. She was hurting, and if he turned away, he'd be burying someone all over again. He didn't speak. Not yet. But something in him shifted. A quiet instinct stirred back to life. The one that says, "Not this time, not again." And in a town full of silence, Caleb Rye did the most radical thing he could. He paid attention.
You ever have one of those moments where silence just won't sit right anymore? Where something in your gut says, if I don't speak now, if I don't act now, it'll haunt me forever? That's where Caleb Rye found himself. Not with a speech, not with some grand gesture, but with 5 words. You all right? That's all he asked her. Quiet, honest, nothing fancy. Marianne had just passed by the trough near the chapel, holding the bucket with both hands like it might be the only thing keeping her steady. There was a bruise, faint but real, just under her eye, her dress stiff with wear, and her body moved like it hurt just to exist inside it. She didn't stop when he asked. She didn't even look at him. But she answered, not loudly, not bitterly, just a whisper so dry it could have cracked in the air. That's what they told the last girl. Now, I don't know about you, but those words hit different. That's not just pain. That's history. That's a buried warning. And Caleb, he heard it. He didn't push her, didn't ask what she meant, but something in his chest, the part that still remembered Barry and his daughter, tightened. Because this wasn't just one girl hurting. This was a pattern, a cycle, one that towns like Bell's Hollow were too polite, too scared, or too proud to break. Later that day, Caleb did something no one expected him to do. He walked into the sheriff's office. Now, in a town like Bell's Hollow, a man like Caleb Rye didn't come into places like that unless something serious was going on. He was a man who fixed things with iron and fire, not with words. And yet, there he was. Dust on his boots, hat in his hand, voice quiet but firm. The girl at the chapel. She's hurt. Sheriff Myron Hensley looked up from his desk, didn't even seem surprised, just leaned back, rifle across his lap, and sighed like he'd heard too many things he didn't want to deal with. Girl's under church care. Reverend feeds her, gives her a roof. Without proof, what you got is gossip, and gossip don't keep the peace. It was the kind of answer that sounds logical if you say it fast enough, but all it really meant was, don't stir the water, let the dirt settle where it falls.
Caleb clenched his jaw. Didn't argue, just turned and left. But here's the thing. Mary Ann had heard him. She had seen him, through the window, standing tall, talking to the sheriff when no one else would. And when he walked out, empty-handed but not defeated, she whispered something to the quiet of that dark, creaking house. Please don't stop noticing. Can you imagine that? Saying that to the air? Not even sure if anyone's listening? It wasn't a plea for rescue. It wasn't even hope. It was survival, raw and stripped down to its last nerve. The kind of thing you say when you've learned that speaking up might not change anything, but staying silent might kill you just the same. I think about that line a lot. Please don't stop noticing. Because sometimes that's the first thing a person needs. Not to be saved, not to be fixed, just to be seen, fully, truthfully, without turning away. And in that moment, without realizing it yet, Caleb Rye became something Mary Ann hadn't had in years. A witness. Not to her weakness, but to her truth. And in a town built on silence, that was the loudest thing anyone could do.
There's a kind of silence that doesn't mean fear anymore. It means enough. That night, Mary Ann didn't cry. She didn't scream or slam the door or throw her fists at the walls. There was no thunder in her exit, just the quiet kind of courage that creeps up on you after years of swallowing your voice. She waited until the house was asleep. Lucille passed out in her rocker, mouth slack, an empty whiskey glass on the floor. The Reverend was gone, off on one of his late-night council visits, though Mary Ann always knew those smelled more like pipe smoke and perfume than scripture. She packed slowly, not because she hesitated, but because everything hurt. Every joint, every bone, every breath. She wrapped a few things in a box, a tin of ointment, a faded photo of her parents, a threadbare shawl, and a Bible worn soft at Psalm 71. No shoes, just a scarf, a handful of coins, and one single note. She placed the box gently on the porch steps and tucked the note beneath the twine. The handwriting was small, careful, but steady. It read, "If anything happens to me, please give this to the man who noticed." That was all. Not a name, not a plea. Just the truth. And then, barefoot and quiet, she stepped into the dark. Now, I don't know if you've ever walked away from something that's tried to break you, a home, a job, a relationship, but there's a moment right before the door shuts behind you where you're not sure if you're brave or just out of choices. That's where Mary Ann was, but she didn't turn back. She walked through the mist all the way out past the edge of town where the sky cracked open wide above Caleb Rye's forge. And when she knocked, just 2 hesitant taps, he opened the door without a word. He didn't ask her what happened. He didn't ask why she came. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he wrapped an old wool blanket around her shoulders and poured warm water into a basin. He cleaned her wrists, careful not to press too hard, handed her a tin cup of broth. She didn't speak, not right away. Not until the fire burned low and the silence between them softened into something that felt almost safe. Then, finally, she whispered, "I left everything." And Caleb, who'd buried more than one thing in his life, a wife, a child, a voice, looked at her and simply said, "Good." She blinked. "That's all you'll say?" He met her eyes, steady, kind, but hard in the way forged things are hard, and said, "Sometimes leaving is louder than shouting." And God, I felt that line. Because it's true, isn't it? We praise the ones who fight with fists and fire, but we forget the strength it takes just to walk, to say no more, to choose yourself, even if you've been told all your life that you belong to someone else. Mary Ann didn't come looking for a savior.
She didn't need Caleb to fix her. She just needed space, stillness, a place where her bruises didn't have to be hidden, and her voice didn't have to beg to be believed. And that night, in a quiet room with nothing but an old chair and a dying fire, she didn't sleep. But for the first time in years, she rested.
Some men hide behind God like a shield. They speak of light while standing in shadow, using scripture like a mask and power like a weapon. And in Bell's Hollow, there was no better example of that than Reverend Silas Coates. When word got out that Marianne had run, slipped out in the middle of the night, and disappeared into the mist, the Reverend didn't panic. He didn't shout. He smiled. But not the kind of smile that says, "She'll be okay." No, it was the kind that says, "This town is still mine." By morning, he was already planning his sermon. Not for Sunday, for Wednesday, a rare, out-of-rhythm gathering. He called it a moment of reflection, but everyone in Bell's Hollow knew what it really was. A warning. Coates had spent years shaping that town's silence like clay. He baptized their children, buried their dead, stood at the pulpit with a polished Bible and the confidence of a man no one dared question. His voice was smooth, measured, a man who preached obedience and wore it like a crown. But not everyone was bowing anymore. Because before that sermon could begin, Caleb Rye walked through the chapel doors. He wasn't dressed for church. Boots scuffed with dust, hands stained with soot, jaw tight like something inside him was coiled and ready to snap. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't need one. He walked straight down the aisle, past the pews, past the whispers, right up to the pulpit. And he didn't ask to speak. He just spoke. The Reverend looked up from arranging hymnals, already wearing that calm, public face, the one built for crowds and control. "Brother Rye," he said, "have you come seeking prayer?" Caleb didn't flinch, didn't blink. He took one step closer, stopped just short of the altar, and said, "She shouldn't be under your roof." The Reverend's smile faltered, only slightly. "I beg your pardon?" Caleb's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You don't shelter her. You don't protect her. You keep her like a dog, one that flinches when you raise your voice." And right there, in the heart of that holy place, the air split clean down the middle. The Reverend adjusted his collar, slow and deliberate. "You're treading dangerous ground, son." Caleb took a step back, not in retreat, but in finality. "I buried my daughter under a cedar tree on Ridgeback Hill. She never flinched when I raised my voice. That's how I know what love isn't." And then he turned, walked down the aisle and out through the chapel doors. He didn't see Marianne pressed against the inner wall of the vestibule, fists clenched, breath held, like a prayer she was too afraid to say out loud. But she heard him, every word, and it hit like lightning, not because it was loud, but because it was true. For the first time in 5 years, someone named what she'd only dared to think. Not just the pain, but the injustice. That moment didn't change everything. Not yet. But it cracked the first stone in a wall that had stood too long. Because once truth echoes inside you, even softly, you can't unhear it. And you sure as hell can't keep pretending you're not ready to fight. Some truths don't shout. They don't storm through the doors or demand justice with fists raised. Some truths come on foot, quiet, with a letter in one hand and years of silence in the other. That's how Marianne came back to Bell's Hollow. Not with fanfare, not with Caleb at her side. She asked him to stay behind because this part, this moment, it had to be hers. The town was already buzzing. Whispers crawling across porches, slipping between the cracks of wooden walls like dust in the wind.
Folks had heard something was coming. They just didn't know what. Or maybe they were afraid they did. The sheriff was the one who opened the chapel doors that day. He stood tall but not proud, more like a man who'd been too quiet for too long and finally understood what that silence cost. Mary Ann walked in behind him, chin high, hands trembling, but she didn't hesitate. And in a pew not far from the altar, Reverend Coates sat stiff, jaw tight, eyes cold. He hadn't moved much since she left. He thought the town still belonged to him, that fear and reputation would keep it that way. But the ground was shifting now. Mary Ann stepped up to the pulpit, the same one he'd preached from for years. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, letting the quiet settle like dust before a storm. Then she held up the letter. "This was sent from a girl who lived in Reverend Coates's house before me," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. She unfolded the page with both hands, carefully, like it might tear from memory alone. "If someone still listens, I was not the first. Please believe her." The letter spoke of nights that were too long, of scripture twisted into shame, of prayers whispered through tears while footsteps creaked outside the door. Gasps rose from the pews, sharp, scattered. Some folks turned away, others just froze. Then Mary Ann looked up, not at the Reverend, not even at the sheriff. She looked at them, at the women who had worked beside her, the men who passed her in the street, the ones who heard her say, "It hurts when I sit," and said nothing. And she said it again, steady this time, like a match against flint. "I said, it hurt to sit. You all looked away. Not out of anger, but out of truth. And that's what made it sting." The Reverend stood, red creeping up his neck like a warning. "This is blasphemy," he snapped. "I have served this town, baptized your children, buried your dead." But the sheriff cut him off. "Sit down, Silas." That's when it happened. One by one, women began to stand. Sister Darlene, a young widow named Clara, even Lucille, his wife. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stood, eyes hollow. And for the first time, she looked like a woman who finally saw what she'd been defending. Mary Ann didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't need to. What she asked for was harder. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to ask you not to forget. Not again." And that was it. She stepped down from the pulpit as quietly as she had entered, but her words stayed, hung in the rafters, sank into the wood of the pews, etched themselves into the bones of that church like they belonged there all along. Outside, Caleb was waiting, arms folded, hat low. When she stepped into the sun, she didn't smile, but she didn't look back either. She just said, "They stood." And he nodded. That was enough. Because sometimes the most powerful sound in the world isn't the voice that calls for justice. It's the silence that finally ends.
Some towns break slowly, not all at once, not in fire or fury, but in silence, like a rope that's held too much weight for too long, fraying thread by thread, until one morning it simply doesn't hold anymore. Bell's Hollow was one of those towns. After everything, after the letter, the testimony, the standing still of women who'd once looked away, something shifted. Not loud, not sudden, but real. Reverend Coates vanished. No sermon, no farewell. Just a note left on his desk in the chapel office.
Some folks said he left for the northern border, maybe tried to start fresh under another name. Others believed he finally faced a reckoning, too quiet for the law to hear. Whatever the truth, the town never saw him again, and no one chased after him. Lucille followed a few days later, packed a single case, face hidden behind a traveling veil. Her walk to the station was slow, almost reverent, like a ghost finally choosing to leave the house it haunted. She didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. Maybe she knew that staying would mean watching the mirror shatter over and over again. And then something unexpected happened. The chapel didn't close. It didn't burn down, but it changed. Sister Darlene, the same woman who once laughed when Marianne said, "It hurts when I sit," was the first to take up the broom. She swept the steps, the ones Marianne had scrubbed on bleeding knees, not out of guilt, but out of understanding. She didn't try to speak over what had happened, she just did the work. That's the thing about healing. It doesn't always come wrapped in apology. Sometimes it comes in showing up and doing better. Quietly. Every day. And the town, little by little, began to soften. People asked questions they never dared ask before. About power. About silence. About what it really means to protect someone. It wasn't perfect. Old habits die hard. But the eyes that once looked away too easily now lingered a little longer when someone seemed off. The whispers in the market shifted, from gossip to concern, from dismissal to care. I remember walking through Bell's Hollow after everything. The air smelled like summer rain and fresh lumber. And the strangest thing, the church bell rang, but it didn't sound the same. It wasn't a call to obedience anymore. It was a call to remember. To remember what they let happen. To remember who stood. And to remember that sometimes the strongest voice in a town is the one that was ignored the longest. There's something sacred in that kind of change. Not flashy, not perfect, but honest. You ever seen a place start over? It doesn't look like a parade. It looks like a woman sweeping steps she once refused to see. It looks like silence, finally broken by truth. And it looks like a town, bruised and humbled, learning how to listen again. Bell's Hollow didn't become a different place overnight, but it began. And sometimes, that's enough.
Some people run to disappear. Others walk away to begin again. Marianne didn't run. After everything, after the trial of truth, after the reverend vanished and the chapel changed, she could have disappeared into the hills and no one would have blamed her. She had every reason to stay hidden, to rest, to fold into someone else's shelter and let the world go on without her. But she didn't want that. She didn't want safety that came from silence. She wanted something hers. So she and Caleb headed west, just past the canyon's edge, to an old homestead near Dry Creek Ridge. The place was falling apart, roof sagging, shutters hanging by splinters, the barn more hole than wall. But it had land. It had space. And it had possibility. I think there's something sacred in choosing to rebuild the very thing life once tried to take from you. Not in spite of the past, but because of it. Marianne didn't treat the land like a hiding place. She treated it like a promise. She planted herbs behind the house, patched torn dresses with scraps of blue linen, stitched the fabric of her days from the ground up. She didn't ask Caleb to do it for her, though he would have. Instead, she worked beside him. Her hands were just as blistered as his, her back just as sore. But this time, the pain had a purpose. And that changes everything, doesn't it? You ever feel that? When you've been broken down by someone else's control for so long, and then suddenly Even the hard work, the sweat, the aching muscles, it feels like freedom, like claiming space with every nail you drive into a beam, every seed you press into the dirt. Caleb never said much. That wasn't his way. But he cleared out the loft for her without asking, left her a hammer and a length of rope on the porch every morning. Not to test her, but to say, "This is yours too." He didn't crowd her with kindness. He just stayed. Present. Solid. And Marianne, she came back to life in her own time. By the time summer rolled around, she was riding her own horse into town, head high, shoulders straight. She wore no veil, no shame, just a plain blue dress with sun-faded sleeves and hands calloused from work that was finally her own. At the market, she set up a small stall beside the blacksmith's, laid out hand-stitched aprons, pouches of dried herbs, bundles of thread. The townsfolk, the same ones who once looked through her like glass, now met her gaze and nodded. No one dared ignore her anymore. Not because they were afraid, but because she'd become someone they couldn't look away from. There's power in that. Not in revenge, but in return. In showing up not as a ghost of who you were, but as the architect of who you choose to be. I think about her a lot. About the way she reclaimed her name, her body, her voice. Not through noise, but through presence. Through building something in a place where something had once been stolen. And I wonder, what would it look like if more of us lived like that? Not just surviving what broke us, but choosing to build where the ashes still smoke. Choosing to say, I am still here. And I'm not just breathing, I'm living. That's what Marianne did. And in her quiet way, she changed everything.
There's something I keep thinking about. It's not the shouting, not the breaking point, not even the fall of the man who wore his faith like armor. It's the moment before all that. The moment a girl, barely 19, whispered 5 words into a room that refused to hear her. It hurts when I sit. That line, soft, almost apologetic, was never meant to echo, but it did. Because somewhere across the road, in the still heat of a New Mexico morning, one man noticed. Caleb Rye, a man who hadn't spoken in years, who'd buried both his voice and his past, looked up and didn't look away. And that changed everything. Marianne had spent years under the roof of people who wore righteousness like a second skin. They said they were saving her, said they were teaching her grace. But what they really did was break her spirit behind closed doors and call it discipline. She was a girl no one questioned, no one protected, and, maybe hardest of all, no one saw. The women who worked beside her saw the bruises, heard the gasps, caught glimpses of her flinch, but they didn't ask. It wasn't cruelty, it was comfort. And comfort makes cowards out of good people sometimes. I wonder how many Mariannes walk through our lives like that. How many quiet pains we excuse because asking would be inconvenient, because listening would require us to do something. But Caleb didn't ask questions that morning. He just noticed. And then he acted. Not with drama, not with heroism, but with the kind of courage that lives in slow, steady steps. He stood beside her, spoke when no one else did, showed up when no one else dared, and when she ran, not to escape, but to reclaim herself, he opened his door, not with pity, but with presence. That's the thing about this story. It's not about revenge. It's not even about justice in the way we usually mean it. It's about truth. About what happens when someone finally stands up and says, what we've allowed can't go on.
Marianne didn't storm back into town demanding respect. She earned it, inch by inch, through presence, through rebuilding, through refusing to disappear. And in doing that, she didn't just save herself, she woke the whole town up. One woman stood beside her, then another. Even the wife of the man who broke her finally lowered her eyes and stood still, silent but aware. The town didn't change overnight, but it cracked. And sometimes that's where the light gets in. And you know what sticks with me the most? It wasn't some grand act that saved Marianne. It wasn't a courtroom or a sheriff or a riot. It was a moment. A quiet one. A blacksmith looking across a street and refusing to let a girl vanish into her pain. Noticing. That's what it was. That was the beginning. And maybe that's all it ever takes. So let me ask you something, and I'm asking myself this too. Who's waiting for you to notice? Because sometimes the smallest act, a glance, a word, a question asked at the right time, isn't small at all. Sometimes it saves a life, and sometimes it starts a revolution.